Hey guys, tonight we set sail toward a far-off shore, a place where the night air is thick with salt and the slow swirl of spices, where every breeze seems to carry a hint of cloves and nutmeg. You can almost feel it brushing across your cheeks now, that heavy, fragrant humidity clinging to your skin. Imagine lantern light bouncing off whitewashed stone walls, shadows flickering against carved wooden balconies, the muffled crash of waves meeting coral reefs just beyond the harbour. You're stepping into Zanzibar centuries ago, when this archipelago wasn't just an island paradise, it was a coveted prize in a global contest for flavour and fortune. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me your location and the local time right now. It's always fascinating to see this little bedtime crew scattered across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking barefoot along the harbour of Stone Town. Lanterns sway on masts and wooden dhows creak as sailors unload baskets of cardamom, cinnamon, and most prized of all, nutmeg. The smell is intoxicating, like stepping into a kitchen, a pharmacy, and a perfume shop all at once. Back then, nutmeg was more than just a spice for eggnog or a dusting over lattes. It was treated like treasure worth its weight in silver. And fun fact, people actually believed a pinch of nutmeg could ward off the plague. Spoiler, it couldn't. If you lived in Europe during the Black Death, well, let's just say you probably wouldn't survive this bedtime story. The archipelago sits like scattered gems off the coast of East Africa Green Islands against an endless blue. Its location made it irresistible, a crossroads where Africa met Arabia, India, and eventually Europe. You don't need a GPS to see why merchants drooled over it. Ships could restock here, take on food and water, and load holds with spices that fetched astronomical prices in the markets of Venice, London, and Amsterdam. Picture it, a handful of nutmeg seeds, wrinkled and unassuming, being worth more than a cow or even a small plot of farmland. In a world without refrigeration, spices weren't just about flavor. They preserved food, masked rot, and hinted at health miracles. Nutmeg, in particular, had a reputation as everything from an aphrodisiac to a cure for headaches. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were genuine or just marketing genius. But either way, nutmeg's reputation made Zanzibar and the islands where it grew worth fighting for. Close your eyes and imagine yourself drifting inland. Palm trees sway overhead while narrow alleyways twist like a maze between coral stone houses. Each turn reveals a carved wooden door, brass studs catching the moonlight. The smell of cooking drifts out, rice simmering in coconut milk, maybe a hint of grilled fish rubbed with cloves. You hear the rhythmic pulse of taarab music, a fusion of African drums and Arabic oud strings echoing from a courtyard. This wasn't just a port for spices, it was a melting pot of cultures. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Nutmeg isn't even native to Zanzibar. Its true birthplace is the Banda Islands, tiny specks in today's Indonesia. But trade routes carried its fame far across the seas, and before long Zanzibar's fertile soil and sultry climate proved perfect for cultivating it. Merchants planted seeds and the islands flourished. You could say nutmeg had its own passport, stamping its way across oceans on the backs of daring traders. As you wander through the night market, you notice stalls piled with saffron, pepper, and ginger, but nutmeg gets its own special shelf, guarded, weighed, carefully wrapped like jewels. The locals whisper about foreign ships anchored just offshore, each flag representing another empire hungry for control. The Portuguese came first, swaggering with cannons and crosses, then the Omani Arabs, weaving Zanzibar into a wider tapestry of trade. Later, the Dutch and the British, each desperate to corner the market. You, though you're just drifting, absorbing the scents, the sounds, and the quiet sense that this little seed could topple kings and build fortunes. The island's story is already unfolding around you, merchants balancing ledgers, sultans plotting alliances, sailors nursing mugs of spiced tea while scheming for their next voyage. All of it, wars, treaties, betrayals, revolves around this curious wrinkled nut. And as the night deepens, you feel the weight of history pressing close like the warm, damp air hugging your skin. Because what you're smelling, what you're touching, isn't just spice, It's the beginning of a global tug-of-war that will reshape continents, redraw maps, and leave legacies still lingering in our kitchens today. You wake with the dawn breaking over the island, the first streaks of sunlight catching on the turquoise waters that lap at Zanzibar's coral shores. The air is already thick with the smell of cloves drying in courtyards, women spreading them out on woven mats, their hands moving in a rhythm passed down through generations. Nutmeg trees hide inland, their glossy leaves whispering in the soft wind, their fruits splitting open to reveal that glossy brown seed, wrapped in a lace-like red covering called mace. You stoop and pick one up. It's beautiful, almost too delicate to be the center of so much drama, but that little nut is about to pull you into the lives of the people who made it, their world. You move toward the plantations where men in loose cotton shirts swing machetes and children chase each other between rows of trees. The island feels alive with labor, but also with stories. Nutmeg and cloves aren't just crops, they're currency, status, even destiny. The men who controlled them were not faceless merchants. They were characters larger than life, whose ambition and cunning steered the fate of empires. First, picture the sultans of Oman with their flowing robes and jeweled daggers, men who shifted their capital from the Arabian desert all the way to this island just to plant their flag over the spice trade. Imagine how bold that decision was, abandoning ancient Muscat, a city rooted in tradition, to claim a small island thousands of miles away, all because the scent of nutmeg and clove meant power. Then there were the Indian traders, meticulous and calculating their ledgers written in neat Gujarati script. They kept the spice wheel turning, lending money, shipping goods, and making sure the numbers always worked in their favor. You see them sitting cross-legged in shaded counting houses, weighing seeds, jotting figures, arguing over contracts in half a dozen languages. Without them, the entire enterprise would have collapsed. And let's not forget the Swahili coast merchants, Zanzibar's own children of the sea. They had traded across the Indian Ocean long before Europeans showed up, piloting dhows by the stars, memorizing winds and currents, and weaving together Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond in a network of exchange. They wore patterned kangas, spoke in a lyrical mix of languages, and carried stories of voyages that spanned generations. As you follow their paths, you realize this wasn't just about big rulers with crowns or governors in palaces. It was also about the ordinary people. Women in bright dresses grinding nutmeg into powder for curries. Healers steeping it into tonics, claiming it soothed stomachs and warded off evil spirit. And yes, here's your quirky tidbit. In some traditions, nutmeg was carried as a charm, in pockets thought to protect against lightning strikes. Practical? Probably not. Comforting? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether these islanders saw themselves as victims of imperial power or savvy players in a dangerous game. Maybe they were both. You can sense the pride in their songs, the resilience in their crafts, and the sharp wit in their negotiations. It wasn't just foreign empires shaping Zanzibar. The locals carved their own place in the spice drama. Picture yourself slipping into one of Stone Town's alleys. Sunlight barely filters through the narrow gap above. On one side, a heavy wooden door studded with brass, each nail head glinting. On the other, a tiny coffee shop where men sip strong brews spiced with cardamom. Overhead, the muezzin's call drifts down from a minaret, mingling with the chatter of market stalls. Every corner tells you this is where worlds collide. And here's another odd little detail. You might stumble upon a musician tuning an oud, strumming out a melody that blends Arabic scales with African drums. This fusion, called taarab, was born here, carried on the winds of trade. Even the music carried the fingerprints of nutmeg's reach, because it was the spice trade that brought instruments, rhythms, and musicians together. You lean against a wall, feeling the warmth of the stone, listening to laughter echo off plaster and coral brick. Life here was textured and layered. At the top of the chain, sultans and traders schemed over monopolies. At the bottom, workers sweated in fields, carrying baskets of nutmeg fruit until their backs ached. And yet, both ends of this spectrum were tied together by the same little spice. It's strange, isn't it? You hold a single nutmeg seed in your palm, barely larger than a marble, and you realize it influenced who wore crowns, who built palaces, who sang songs, and even what people cooked for dinner. Such a tiny thing, yet it pulsed through every vein of society. The sun climbs higher now, baking the streets. Merchants haggle the smell of frying fish, drifts from a stall, and your sandals kick up the dust as you wander deeper inland. The plantations stretch before you, endless rows of trees, swaying gently like a green army ready to march. And you can feel it, this is the foundation, the stage upon which the battles of empires will soon play out. Because behind the beauty of the nutmeg groves, a storm is brewing. Foreign ships are anchoring just beyond the reefs, flags snapping in the wind, cannons glinting in the sun. They're not here for sightseeing, they're here because nutmeg doesn't just season food, it seasons history. The sun dips lower on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the sea, and you can almost feel the atmosphere shift. The lazy rhythm of market chatter gives way to whispers of change, the kind of tension that prickles your skin before a storm. You follow the path back toward the harbour, where foreign sails now crowd the horizon, each mast bristling like spears. This is no peaceful gathering of traders, this is the prelude to conflict, the kind of history where fortunes are seized, not shared. You see the first ships that claimed Zanzibar, the Portuguese caravels, their hulls painted with bold red crosses. They stride into the Indian Ocean in the 1500s, chasing spice routes with the swagger of men who believe God himself gave them a monopoly. They weren't subtle about it either. Cannons, booming fortresses, rising priests planting crosses in freshly turned earth. Imagine standing on the shoreline as a cannonball whistled overhead. That's when you'd realize nutmeg wasn't just a seasoning anymore, it was a weapon worth dying for. But the Portuguese grip didn't last forever. The Omani Arabs, already masters of these waters, pushed them out. You can almost hear the clash of steel, the thunder of cannons, and the creak of wooden ships locked in battle near the reefs. By the late 1600s, Oman seized control, shifting the balance of power. Picture the Sultan's court shimmering with silk, his advisors whispering strategies, and always the scent of nutmeg and clove rising from the gardens outside. The Sultans knew this island wasn't just beautiful, it was a golden key to a locked treasure chest. Then, from across the oceans, another flag appeared on the horizon, the Dutch. And if the Portuguese were brash and the Omanis determined, the Dutch were obsessive. They weren't just trading, they were monopolizing, scheming, fencing off nutmeg like a dragon hoarding gold. Remember those Banda Islands I mentioned? The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, if you want the fancy acronym, decided that nutmeg could only come from their grip. They planted fortresses, imposed brutal laws, and in one of history's darker twists carried out massacres on the Banda people to enforce their monopoly. Yes, over a spice. Historians still argue whether this was pure economic calculation or the fever dream of greedy merchants, but either way the result was bloody. And yet Zanzibar, with its fertile soil, sat there like a glittering alternative, a rival, a temptation. Everyone wanted it, Portuguese, Arabs, Dutch, and later the English. Imagine being an islander watching all these foreign powers circle like sharks, each convinced that without nutmeg, their empire would starve. Here's your quirky tidbit: nutmeg was so valuable in Europe that entire islands were traded for it. No joke, the Dutch literally swapped Manhattan with the English in the 1667 Treaty of Breda, agreeing to give up New Amsterdam, future New York, in exchange for a tiny nutmeg island in the Banda chain. That's right, Wall Street was traded for seasoning. Makes you look at your spice rack a little differently, doesn't it? Back in Zanzibar, you stroll past warehouses stuffed with burlap sacks. Each sack is guarded, accounted for, almost worshipped. You hear merchants whispering about prices, about which empire will control the next shipment. The stakes are climbing higher by the day. Ordinary islanders keep working the fields, but you sense their unease. The more valuable nutmeg becomes abroad, the more dangerous life becomes at home. Historians still debate whether Zanzibar's rise as a spice hub was inevitable, or if it was purely the byproduct of global politics collapsing elsewhere. But walking here with the salty breeze in your hair and the calls of sailors echoing in your ears, it feels inevitable. The land is too fertile, the harbour too perfect, the smell of nutmeg too irresistible. Night falls again and lanterns flicker on the docks. You pause, listening to the sea slap against wooden hulls. Somewhere in the dark, men are plotting sultans, planning alliances, Dutch merchants bribing their way into advantage, English captains readying for raids, and you're caught in the middle, a silent witness, as Zanzibar is swept into a larger storm. The air feels heavier now, charged with a sense of foreboding. You know the battles over nutmeg aren't just going to shape this island, they're going to ripple across continents, drawing in kings, merchants, and everyday people into a global tug-of-war. And the first shots of that war have already been fired. The cannon smoke clears, the echoes fade, and you find yourself standing in the uneasy silence that follows upheaval. Zanzibar has been claimed, reclaimed, and claimed again. And now the real consequences begin to show. It's not just who holds the fort on the shoreline, it's how society bends, reshapes, and sometimes breaks under the weight of spice wealth. The Omani sultans consolidate their rule, and with them comes a new rhythm. You see it in the architecture, grand palaces with arched windows and open courtyards, blending Arabian grace with Swahili practicality. You hear it in the bustling languages of the bazaar, where Arabic, Swahili, Hindi, and Portuguese all tangle in a single conversation. You even taste it in the food, nutmeg grated into stews, sprinkled into sweet halwa, stirred into coffee, until the air itself feels perfumed. But underneath that fragrant surface lies something darker. Plantations spread like wildfire across the island, swallowing villages, forests, and lives. Nutmeg and clove are thirsty crops demanding endless labor. And so the sultans lean on a brutal engine, the slave trade. You walk through the marketplace at Stone Town, the ground dusty beneath your sandals, and you can't ignore the cries. Men, women, and children are lined up, auctioned alongside sacks of spice. One human life priced in the same breath as a basket of nutmeg. It's harrowing, unsettling, and it makes you question how something so small, so sweet-smelling, could be tied to so much suffering. Every day, Zanzibaris feel the ripple. Some profit traders counting coins by lantern-light shipbuilders, hammering planks, scribes jotting contracts. Others suffer laborers, bent double in the fields, shackled nameless their sweat, feeding the hunger of distant empires. You catch snatches of Tarab songs that carry both joy and sorrow, verses praising love and beauty, but also veiled lines lamenting bondage and loss. The music is subtle protest, coded memory and resilience, disguised as entertainment. Here's your quirky tidbit. Clove pickers were sometimes required to chew cloves while harvesting, both to freshen their breath and to mask the smell of sweat when overseers came near. Practical, maybe. Strange, definitely. Imagine your boss today insisting you eat cinnamon gum all day just to stay professional. And yet, amidst this harsh reality, people find ways to stitch meaning into their lives. Families gather in courtyards after long days, cooking meals spiced with nutmeg and cardamom, telling stories that weave magic into hardship. Children still chase each other through alleys, laughter echoing between coral walls. Life refuses to be flattened even by empires. Historians still argue whether Zanzibar thrived because of the Sultan's strong governance or in spite of it. Was the island's prosperity a testament to visionary leadership, or simply the inevitable result of being in the right place at the right time? As you walk the narrow lanes, you can sense the paradox, a society glittering on the surface, built on a foundation that trembles with every shifting tide of empire. By now, Zanzibar's reputation has spread. In London, drawing rooms, nutmeg is shaved onto hot drinks as a symbol of elegance. In Dutch kitchens, it's stirred into sauces, a taste of distant conquest. And here on the island itself, it's both lifeline and chain. The wealth it generates builds mosques, schools, and lavish homes, while the cruelty it demands carves scars into human history. You sit on the steps of a stone house, watching the bustle of the evening market. The glow of oil lamps reflects off brass bowls filled with saffron, turmeric, and cloves. Traders argue, laughter rings out, and somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic beat of drums begins again. The contradictions of this place wash over you, beauty and brutality, wealth and want, all bound together by a spice that most people today sprinkle casually over dessert. As the night deepens, you lean back against the cool stone and realize Zanzibar isn't just an island anymore. It has become a symbol, a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the cruelty of human ambition, and the storm of empire. It's still gathering strength. The next wave of challenges is already on the horizon, sails taut, cannons ready, and eyes fixed greedily on Nutmeg. The waves roll steady against Zanzibar's reef, but history here is never calm for long. You're walking inland again past clove groves, stretching like green carpets, their blossoms sweet in the air. The sultans and traders have already reshaped the island, but what lingers, what endures, are the lessons and legacies of this strange and fiery obsession with nutmeg. You bend down to pick up one of the fruits fallen from the trees. The outer flesh is pale yellow, splitting open to reveal the nutmeg seed wrapped in that red webbing of mace. You roll it in your palm and wonder how such a small object taught humanity some of its harshest lessons. The first lesson is simple: greed burns hotter than the sun. Empires sent fleets, raised armies, and enslaved thousands over something most of us today sprinkle into a pumpkin pie without a second thought. You taste that irony with a faint bitterness, like the aftertaste of spice on your tongue. The second lesson is about resilience. For all the violence of conquest, Zanzibar's culture didn't vanish. It absorbed, adapted, and transformed. You hear it in Taarab music, blending Arabic oud with African drums. You see it in carved doorways that tell stories in patterns of wood and brass, and you smell it in kitchens where nutmeg marries coconut rice and fish into dishes that carry both survival and celebration. Everyday people kept their songs, their recipes, and their humor even as empires loomed overhead. Here's your quirky tidbit: nutmeg was once believed to cause hallucinations if eaten in large amounts, and there are records of adventurous souls downing spoonfuls to see visions. The truth: too much nutmeg just makes you miserably sick. Definitely not the trippy spice some 17th century dreamers hoped for. But the greater legacy is in how nutmeg reshaped the world map. Remember that tiny swap, the Dutch trading Manhattan for a nutmeg island? That decision didn't just change trade, it changed history. The bustling skyscrapers of New York exist partly because Europe was obsessed with seasoning. Historians still argue whether the sultans of Oman could ever have foreseen that a little seed in Zanzibar's soil would ripple out into Wall Street's towers centuries later. And yet the most profound legacy isn't political, it's human. Walk through Zanzibar today and you'll still find cloves drying in the sun, nutmeg for sale in markets, and families passing down spice-rich recipes. These are more than flavors. They're memories, survival, and identity carried through generations. The plantations left scars, yes, but they also planted roots that communities reclaimed in their own way. You wander into Stone Town's narrow alleys where balconies almost touch overhead and pause at a spice shop. Glass jars glint in the dim light, filled with powders of every shade: reds, yellows, browns, and the rich, golden hue of nutmeg. The shopkeeper smiles, scoops a little into your palm, and you breathe it in. Warm, sweet, slightly sharp. The same scent that once lured Portuguese caravels and Dutch warships now floats calmly in a quiet room available to anyone with a few coins. The world has shifted, but the spice endures. As the evening cools, you sit on the edge of the harbour, lanterns glowing on the water. The lesson becomes clearer. Nutmeg shows us the best and worst of ourselves. Our drive to explore, to connect, to savor new tastes, and our capacity to exploit, to fight, to enslave. Both truths live in that wrinkled seed. Both are part of the legacy you've been walking through all along. You glance at the sea where ships once bristled with cannons. Tonight, only fishing boats bob on the tide, sails furled like folded wings. But the echoes of empire are still there, carried on the waves, whispering reminders. Nutmeg isn't just spice, it's memory, it's lesson, it's a mirror. And as you rise to wander back into the alleys, the question hums quietly in your chest. How much of today's world was built on tiny things we barely notice? Seeds, scents, or even the faint trace of spice on your breath. The streets of Stone Town are hushed again, lanterns flickering low shadows, stretching long across coral stone walls. You pause at a quiet corner, and for a moment you realize this journey is far from finished. The island's saga doesn't end with lessons and legacies. It spills forward into a fading glory, into whispers of what comes next. The empires that fought tooth and nail for Nutmeg aren't gone yet, but their grip is loosening, and Zanzibar is about to feel the shift. The 19th century creeps in with the sound of steam engines and the flutter of European treaties. The Omani sultans still rule, but their thrones wobble. Britain peers across the ocean with calculating eyes, and Germany, too, sniffing opportunities. Suddenly, nutmeg and cloves aren't just fragrant cargo, they're bargaining chips in a larger imperial game. You watch as European consuls arrive, their stiff coats sweating in the tropical heat, drawing up papers that claim protectorates and spheres of influence. They sip tea spiced with nutmeg while quietly slicing up whole nations. And Zanzibar, it's caught in the crossfire. Palaces rise like the House of Wonders, its iron beams and clock tower declaring modernity. But outside those grand halls, the slave trade still drags on. You hear the chains clink faintly in the marketplace, even as abolitionists in Europe raise their voices. The contradictions are almost dizzying: opulence and oppression, reform and resistance, all crammed into the same streets you walk tonight. Here's your quirky tidbit: the shortest war in history took place in Zanzibar. In 1896, after a succession dispute, the British bombarded the island. The fight lasted just 38 minutes before surrender. 38 minutes shorter than some of your Netflix episodes, and it marked the official end of the Sultan's independent rule. The social fabric shifts too. Freed slaves carve out new communities, clinging to land and labor rights with fragile hope. Merchants recalculate, balancing spice profits with the rise of ivory, rubber, and other trades. Historians still argue whether Zanzibar's golden age was already over by then, or if the island still shimmered in the twilight glow of empire. From your vantage point, sitting on the worn stone steps of an old mosque, it feels like both at once a world clinging to the past, even as it tumbles into the future. You stroll down to the harbour where steamships now jostle against wooden dhows. The old rhythms, the monsoon winds, the star-guided voyages are giving way to coal smoke and iron hulls. The global spice monopoly, once guarded by cannon and blood, dissolves into a free-flowing tide of commerce. Nutmeg, once rare enough to trade for cities, now sits in kitchen cupboards from Boston to Bombay. Its magic, its danger, its exclusivity, all softened into a common seasoning. And yet for Zanzibar, the cost of that shift is steep. The island's fortunes dim its role in global trade, shrinking as other economies rise. You walk past warehouses with their shutters closed, once bulging with spice sacks, now quiet and dusty. Stone Town's carved doors still stand proud, but some houses crumble at the edges, plaster peeling under the relentless salt air. The scent of nutmeg still lingers, yes, but it's mingled with something else, something wistful, like memory itself. Night deepens and you lean against the railing of the waterfront. The stars glitter overhead, the same constellations sailors once used to chart their voyages. And you realize Zanzibar's story isn't over. It's evolving, slipping from the hands of sultans and merchants into the imaginations of travelers, historians, and, well, you. Because if nutmeg taught the world anything, it's that small things can reshape history. And though Zanzibar's golden age fades, the fragrance still lingers, a reminder in every sprinkle of spice that empires once rose and fell, chasing after seeds small enough to slip through your fingers. The sea lies calm tonight, the tide sliding gently over the reef, but your mind drifts outward far from Zanzibar's shores. Because while the Omani sultans and Zanzibari traders shaped the island's destiny across the oceans, new rivals were sharpening their knives. The English, ambitious and restless, were already circling like gulls over a fishing boat, eager to snatch what others had fought to protect. You picture the English captains swaggering onto wooden decks, their coats flapping in the salty wind. Some were privateers, glorified pirates with licenses from the crown. Others were company men dispatched by the East India Company with contracts and cannons alike. Their eyes glistened not with wonder at the Spice Islands, but with calculation. Nutmeg meant profits, and profits meant power. You can almost hear them muttering over maps. Why should the Dutch have all the pie? By the 17th century, English ambitions were simmering. They had already nibbled at the edges of global trade tobacco, in Virginia cotton in India, sugar in the Caribbean. But spices, especially nutmeg, were the crown jewel they still lacked. Imagine their frustration watching the Dutch lock down the Banda Islands like a miser chaining his treasure chest. That jealousy fueled skirmishes at sea, negotiations at gunpoint, and endless arguments in London's smoky coffee houses. Here's your quirky tidbit in the 1600s. London's coffee houses weren't just for sipping lattes. They were hubs of gossip, speculation, and outright scheming. Merchants crowded around arguing over whether nutmeg prices would rise or fall, the way we obsess today over stock markets or cryptocurrency. Yes, nutmeg was basically the Bitcoin of its time, volatile, coveted, and capable of making or breaking fortunes overnight. You lean on a wooden railing watching the English ships that dared challenge Dutch monopolies. Some raids succeeded, cargo seized, holds emptied into English markets where nutmeg fetched astronomical sums. Others ended in disaster, ships sunk, men lost fortunes, ruined. Historians still argue whether the English had a real strategy at first, or if they were just opportunistic marauders who got lucky until empire followed. Meanwhile, back in Zanzibar, whispers of English interest spread. Local merchants knew what foreign sales meant: new buyers, new bargaining chips, but also new risks. You imagine sitting in a counting house as Indian traders weigh their options, sell to the Dutch at one price, to the English at another, hedge their bets, keep their fingers crossed. Spices weren't just flavor, they were futures contracts in human form. The English also carried something else across the seas: stories. Nutmeg wasn't just promoted as delicious, it was said to cure ailments from stomach aches to the plague. You picture London apothecaries measuring out powder into glass vials, charging fortunes to desperate customers who clung to the hope that a pinch of spice could save them. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Still, the myth gave nutmeg a halo that no rival commodity could match. The battle between the Dutch and English stretched for decades. Sometimes it was open war with cannon fire echoing over tropical seas. Sometimes it was subtler treaties signed in candlelit halls, ink-staining parchment, while sailors bled far away. And occasionally it was downright absurd, like when the Treaty of Breda in 1667 settled disputes by trading New Amsterdam, future New York, for a tiny nutmeg island in the Banda chain. You've heard this before, but it's worth pausing on an entire modern metropolis swapped for spice. Somewhere, a Dutch merchant was probably grinning into his mug of beer, convinced he'd made the deal of the century. History, of course, had other ideas. Here on the island, you can feel the tension tightening. The Dutch fortress looms, its walls thick, its guards vigilant, while just over the horizon, English sails glimmer. To the ordinary farmer bent over nutmeg groves, it must have seemed absurd. Foreign powers killing each other over the same seeds you harvested with bare hands. And yet those seeds held the world hostage. The sun dips, lanterns glow, and the sound of waves merges with your own thoughts. This isn't just a local story anymore. Zanzibar is caught in the middle of a larger chessboard where the English are making their move, eager to topple Dutch dominance and claim their own slice of the fragrant empire. You exhale slowly, the scent of spice still clinging to the air, and realize the struggle over nutmeg is far from settled. The English are only just beginning their climb, and the French, well, they're waiting in the wings, ready with their own tricks up their sleeves. The sea glimmers silver under the moonlight, and you sense a new player stepping onto the stage. While the Dutch clench their fists around the Banda Islands and the English sharpen their ambitions, the French appear stylish, cunning, and not above a little botanical thievery. If the spice game was a grand masquerade, the French were the masked tricksters, slipping into the ballroom with a wink and a stolen seed hidden in their pockets. You picture French explorers and naturalists arriving in the Indian Ocean, not with roaring cannons at first, but with clever smiles and quiet hands. They knew the Dutch guarded nutmeg like a dragon guards treasure, burning any seedlings that slipped through their control. So the French devised plots worthy of a spy novel. They smuggled live nutmeg plants out of the East Indies, sometimes disguised as common shrubs, sometimes bribing locals to tuck seeds into baskets of fruit. You imagine one particularly bold sailor trying to sneak a seedling past Dutch inspectors by stuffing it under his wig. Was that true? Hard to say, but it feels just about crazy enough to have happened. By the 1770s, the French succeeded. They transplanted nutmeg to their colonies, Réunion, Mauritius, and later Grenada in the Caribbean. The Dutch monopoly, once ironclad, was suddenly porous. Nutmeg trees flourished on new soil, spreading the spice beyond its native isles. You walk through one of these transplanted groves in your imagination. Now the glossy leaves trembling in an unfamiliar breeze, the air thick with the same scent that once fueled massacres in Banda. The trees don't care about borders or monopolies, they just grow. Historians still argue whether these French smuggling operations were carefully orchestrated by officials or merely the bold improvisations of individual adventurers. Either way, the outcome was seismic. The spice that had been worth more than gold, that had inspired wars and treaties, was slipping into the hands of anyone ambitious enough to plant it. Back in Zanzibar, whispers of these developments spread across counting houses and plantations. Merchants muttered over ledgers. If nutmeg could grow in the Caribbean, if it could be bought in Paris or London without Dutch approval, what would that mean for the island's fortunes? You sense both relief and fear. Relief, because monopolies breed resentment. Fear, because an open market might strip Zanzibar of its privileged place in the global trade. And here's your quirky tidbit: the French didn't just smuggle nutmeg, they also smuggled cloves, cinnamon, and even breadfruit, hoping to seed their colonies with every profitable crop. In one infamous case, French explorer Pierre Poivre, his last name literally meaning pepper, organized massive plant thefts that earned him the nickname the Spice Smuggler. Imagine introducing yourself at a party. "Hi, I'm Mr. Pepper, and yes, I steal spices for a living." Instant legend. As you stroll along Zanzibar's waterfront, you feel the shift. The cannons and fortresses still loom, but the true battle is moving underground into the shadows of smuggling and seed stealing. Wars may rage, treaties may be signed, but in the end, one man slipping a nutmeg plant into his satchel can upend centuries of empire building. The irony isn't lost on you. For all their power, the Portuguese, Dutch, and English couldn't completely control a tree. Nature has its own stubborn will, and humans, clever, greedy, restless humans, will always find a way to bend rules. A seed once planted doesn't ask for permission. You pause at the edge of the harbour, the salty breeze cooling your face. Lanterns bob on the water, dhows creak in their moorings, and in the distance you hear faint laughter. Maybe it's from smugglers toasting their success, or from merchants realizing the world is changing. The monopoly dream is cracking, and through those cracks, nutmeg is beginning to spread across the globe, like the scent of spice carried on the wind. The night is heavy, the kind of night where every sound echoes footsteps on cobblestone, distant drums, and the low hum of the sea. But as you wander deeper into Stone Town, another sound overtakes the music and chatter, the murmur of crowds gathering in the market square. You follow the voices, and suddenly you're standing in front of one of the island's darkest realities, the slave market, where human beings were bought and sold alongside the very spices that made Zanzibar famous. The air here is suffocating. Torches flicker, casting long shadows over the coral stone walls. Men stand in chains, their wrists bound, their eyes hollow but defiant. Women clutch children, close their bodies, weary from the long march from the African interior. Traders circle like vultures, inspecting teeth muscles, scars measuring a life the way they'd weigh a sack of nutmeg. It's a scene that makes you flinch, even in imagination, because the cruelty is so raw. This is the part of Zanzibar's story that spices alone can't sweeten. The plantations that filled the air with the perfume of cloves and nutmeg demanded endless labor. That labor came from enslaved men and women dragged here from as far inland as present-day Congo and Malawi. You picture them trudging for weeks, sometimes months, along caravan routes, shackled together, driven by whip cracks and hunger, before finally reaching the coast. And when they arrived, they were forced onto auction blocks, sold to work the very fields that had drawn empires across oceans. Historians still argue about the scale of the Zanzibar slave trade. Some estimate tens of thousands per year. At its peak, others argue higher, but all agree it was one of the largest markets in East Africa. The numbers blur, but the reality is carved into every stone you touch as you walk through the old slave chambers, still standing today, low-ceilinged, airless rooms where people were crammed before being sold. Here's your quirky tidbit. Enslaved workers in Zanzibar were sometimes paid not with money, but with cloves. Yes, cloves. Imagine clocking out of your job today and your boss hands you a sack of nutmeg instead of a paycheck. Sounds absurd now, but back then, cloves and nutmeg weren't just seasonings, they were currency as good as coin in many places. The plantations grew, fortunes swelled, and sultans flaunted their wealth in palaces of coral and lime. But at the base of it all was the suffering of thousands whose names history rarely remembers. And yet even in this shadow, you sense resilience. Enslaved people carried their traditions, their songs, their rhythms. They wove fragments of their culture into Zanzibar's heartbeat. The drumbeats you hear in taarab music tonight, some of them echo from those who were chained in fields by day but sang by firelight at night. The cruelty was visible even to outsiders. European missionaries who arrived in the 1800s wrote with horror about what they saw, describing markets where humans were displayed like livestock. They lobbied for abolition, pressing Britain to intervene. And yet here's the paradox: they did so while sipping tea spiced with nutmeg, enjoying the very luxuries the system produced. You step away from the market square, your sandals scraping the stones. The air feels thicker here, as though it remembers. And maybe it does. Zanzibar is beautiful, fragrant, alive with music and color, but it carries scars. Every sack of spice shipped abroad was touched by suffering hands. Every coin counted in the counting houses bore silent witnesses. The night deepens. You pass a courtyard where children play their laughter ringing out under the stars. Life continues even in the shadow of cruelty, but you can't shake the image of the marketplace, the chains, the weary eyes. This is part of the spice story too, the part that lingers long after the sweetness fades from your tongue. The morning sun rises over Zanzibar, flooding the streets of Stone Town with a golden haze. You step outside, feeling the warmth creep across the coral stone walls, and you notice a new rhythm has taken hold. The slave market may still haunt the square, but the world beyond is stirring, and abolitionist winds are sweeping across the Indian Ocean. Slowly, painfully, the spice empire is changing. By the early 19th century, the British had emerged as global enforcers of abolition. They had already banned the slave trade in their own empire, and now turned their navy into patrolmen of the seas. You imagine sleek British ships cutting across the waters near Zanzibar, intercepting dhows heavy with human cargo, boarding them at musket point. Sailors break open the holds and the stench of cramped bodies fills the air. Some captives stumble into the sunlight free for the first time in months. Others are too weak to stand. The ocean had carried cruelty, but now sometimes it carried deliverance. But abolition in Zanzibar was complicated. The sultans still relied on slave labor to harvest cloves and nutmeg, and merchants still made fortunes selling human beings. The British couldn't simply snap their fingers and end it. Instead, they leaned on diplomacy, sometimes velvet-gloved, sometimes iron-fisted. In 1822, they signed treaties with Sultan Said bin Sultan, who had shifted his court from Oman to Zanzibar, making the island the beating heart of his empire. The agreement limited the export of slaves to Christian lands, but allowed the trade to continue to Muslim markets. It was progress, but only partial. Here's your quirky tidbit. Sultan Said wasn't just a ruler, he was a fan of Western gadgets. He once sent Queen Victoria a gift of cloves and received a piano in return. Picture that for a moment, a piano in a palace on Zanzibar, ivory keys gleaming under spice-scented air. Did he actually play it? Historians still argue whether he even knew how, but the symbolism was clear. Zanzibar was now tied not just to trade winds, but to diplomacy and cultural exchange. The British kept pressing. Missionaries like David Livingstone, yes, the same Dr. Livingstone, I presume Guy, travelled inland and wrote vivid reports of the horrors they witnessed. Their words stirred outrage in Europe, fueling pressure on Parliament to act harder against the East African slave trade. Livingstone's descriptions weren't just moral arguments, they were bestsellers consumed by readers sipping tea, flavored with cloves, that ironically came from the very plantations he condemned. Back on the island, tensions mounted. British officials strolled Stone Town in starched uniforms, negotiating treaties while eyeing every dhow in the harbour. Sultans balanced precariously too much resistance, and they risked bombardment from the Royal Navy. Too much compliance, and they risked revolt from their own merchants. It was a tightrope walk, and every gust of political wind threatened to topple them. You walk through a plantation now, the scent of nutmeg heavy in the air. The workers bend low just as before, but whispers ripple through the rows. Change is coming, even if slowly. Some enslaved families dream of freedom, others remain shackled in uncertainty. History is messy, full of half measures and compromises, and Zanzibar embodies that perfectly. By the mid-19th century, British influence tightened further. Treaties were expanded, patrols grew fiercer, and abolitionist zeal refused to fade. In 1873, Sultan Bargash bin Said was finally forced to sign a treaty officially abolishing the slave trade in Zanzibar. The market-closed chains were struck, and for a moment the air must have felt lighter. And yet here's the bitter truth. Slavery, as practice, lingered for decades, hidden in corners, reshaped but not erased. As you wander back into Stone Town, you notice something else. The architecture itself tells this story. The carved wooden doors, studded with brass, were built during this era of transition. Some belonged to rich spice traders who once trafficked in people. Others to families who prospered, after abolition reshaped commerce. The doors remain silent witnesses to shifting tides. You pause in front of one particularly ornate doorway, its frame carved with vines and Quranic inscriptions, and you imagine the conversations that must have happened inside. Merchants debating British treaties, families arguing about what the end of slavery would mean for their fortunes, children listening wide-eyed to sailors' stories of faraway lands. The island is changing. The spice empire, once built on the backs of enslaved labor, is being reshaped by treaties, diplomacy, and outside pressure. The scent of nutmeg still lingers, but the winds carry whispers of freedom, uneven and imperfect though it may be. The sun climbs higher. The marketplace bustles again, this time with buyers of spices rather than human beings. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear the echoes of chains rattling beneath the clamor. Zanzibar cannot escape its past, it can only transform it. The noonday sun presses down hot and relentless, and you wander further inland away from the harbor bustle and deeper into the emerald folds of Zanzibar's plantations. Here the land itself has become a character, lush, fragrant, and shaped by centuries of human ambition. Rows of clove trees stand like soldiers at attention, their buds drying on mats under the sun. Between them, nutmeg trees rise taller, their branches swaying lazily, each fruit concealing the prize that had once commanded empires. You pause beneath one tree, watching as a farmer splits open a nutmeg fruit. Inside, the glossy brown seed gleams wrapped in a crimson lace of mace, another spice nearly as valuable. The farmer's hands move with practiced ease, separating, drying, storing. For him it's routine. For you it feels like a ritual, the repetition of an act that once altered the world's history. The plantations transformed Zanzibar. Under Sultan Said bin Sultan in the 1800s, the island became the global capital of clove production. Ships left its shores laden with sacks of spice, bound for Bombay, Muscat, and London. At its peak, Zanzibar supplied up to 90% of the world's cloves. Imagine that one small island feeding the cravings of millions across continents. It's like if your local farmer's market supplied every Starbucks on the planet. Historians still argue whether Zanzibar's dominance was inevitable or if it was a lucky accident of soil climate and timing. Some say the Sultan's ruthless organization made it possible. Others point to nature itself, the humid air, the volcanic soil, the trade winds that carried seeds to fertile ground. Either way, the result was staggering. The island that once merely traded spices had become their greatest producer. Here's your quirky tidbit: clove trees can live for over 100 years. Some of the very groves planted in the 19th century are still alive today, quietly producing buds generation after generation. It means that somewhere on Zanzibar, you might stand under a tree that once perfumed Queen Victoria's tea or flavored a French chef's sauce in Paris 2 centuries ago. Time collapses under its branches. You walk through the plantation paths, the scent of cloves, sharp and sweet, mingling with the richer, nutty aroma of drying nutmeg. Workers sing as they tend the groves, their songs carrying across the fields. These rhythms, passed down for generations, blend African traditions with Arabic cadences and Indian instruments, a human echo of the very trade networks that shaped the island. The plantations weren't just fields, they were engines of wealth. Sultan Said built his massive palace at Matoni with profits from cloves and nutmeg. He hosted foreign dignitaries in lavish halls, the air thick with the scent of flowers and spice, while outside the palace walls caravans of workers trudged in with baskets of harvest. The contrast was stark, but typical of empires everywhere: luxury for a few, labor for the many. Still, for all the inequality, there's something hypnotic about the order of the plantations. The way the trees align in neat rows, the way the spice harvests follow the rhythm of the seasons, the way the island itself seems to breathe with cycles of planting and drying. You almost forget the politics, the wars, the human suffering, and just marvel at the strange beauty of agriculture scaled to empire. And yet shadows creep in even here. Droughts sometimes ruined harvests, cyclones tore through groves, uprooting decades of work in a single night. Fires spread, consuming sacks of drying cloves. Nature reminded the sultans that power could never be absolute. The empire of spice rested not just on human ambition, but on the whims of rain and wind. You step onto a hilltop and glance back at the shimmering sea. Dhows with billowing sails still carry spice cargo across the horizon. But now, instead of being a simple port of trade, Zanzibar itself has become the beating heart of global spice production. Nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon all flow outward from these very groves, binding the world together in fragrant chains. The sun begins to dip, and a breeze stirs the fields. You breathe deeply the spice-scented air, filling your lungs. It feels both intoxicating and sobering, knowing this land once reshaped empires with nothing more than the perfume of a tree. Evening drapes itself over Stone Town, the coral walls glowing soft pink as the sun sinks low. You wander back into the maze of narrow alleys where the heart of Zanzibar's culture beats strongest. If the plantations were the island's lungs, then Stone Town is its voice, echoing with laughter, argument, and song carrying the blended languages of centuries. The call to prayer floats above the rooftops from a minaret, its melody weaving with the ringing of church bells and the chanting of Hindu hymns. Few places in the world blend so many faiths and tongues into one harmony. Here you can hear Arabic, Swahili, Gujarati, and Portuguese all stitched together into daily conversation. A shopkeeper might haggle with you in one language, then turn and bless a customer in another without missing a beat. You duck into the marketplace where the colors dazzle under oil lamps. Baskets overflow with saffron, cardamom, cinnamon, and of course nutmeg. Fish glisten on crushed ice and mangoes glow like captured suns. The air is thick with the scent of grilling octopus, street vendors fanning smoke toward the stars. A woman in a kanga, patterned with bold Swahili proverbs, ladles out bowls of spiced rice pilau, its aroma tugging you closer. Each bite carries cloves, cinnamon and nutmeg, the same flavors that drew empires across oceans, now simmering in an ordinary dinner. Historians still argue whether Zanzibar's cosmopolitanism was born more from necessity or choice. Was it simply a crossroads of trade that forced cultures together, or did its people actively embrace the mixing, building something richer than the sum of its parts? Whatever the answer, the evidence is in front of you. Every alley, every recipe, every carved door whispers of a life shaped by encounter and exchange. Here's your quirky tidbit. The grand wooden doors of Stone Town weren't just pretty decoration. Those studded brass spikes, they originally came from India, where such spikes protected against charging elephants. On Zanzibar, Where elephants were nowhere to be found, the spikes became a symbol of status instead. Imagine installing an anti-tiger moat in your suburban backyard. Practicality fades, but the statement lingers. Music swells from a courtyard nearby. You slip inside to find a group gathered for Tarab Zanzibar's signature sound. The singer's voice is low and sultry, gliding over the oud strings, while violins and drums weave in and out. The lyrics, often poetic and biting, speak of love, betrayal, and longing. You sway with the crowd, the rhythm pulling you deeper into the island's spirit. This is no imported European opera, no purely African drum circle. It's both and more. It's Zanzibar distilled into sound. Walking again, you pass old colonial houses, their balconies jutting overhead. Some are crumbling vines crawling across the plaster. Others still shine, repainted in pastel blues and whites. Children chase one another under archways, their laughter ricocheting off walls polished by centuries of touch. You realize that history isn't locked in books here, it's alive, painted onto walls, sung in songs stirred into cooking pots. The night grows darker, lanterns glowing like stars trapped in glass. You sit at a cafe where men sip sweet cardamom tea and smoke from hookahs coils upward like incense. Conversations buzz about trade politics and family ordinary life, layered over extraordinary history. The Nutmeg Empire still shapes everything here, but it has been woven so seamlessly into culture that most forget it was once a prize worth dying for. And as you sip your tea, fragrant with cloves and sugar, you wonder maybe this is what empire eventually becomes. Not cannons and treaties, not slave chains or smuggling schemes, but flavor song and memory. A legacy softened by time, still sharp in places, but mostly mellowed into daily life. The hour grows late, but Stone Town refuses to sleep. And you lean back, the hum of voices surrounding you, the spice-scented night pressing close, and you feel that the island is whispering directly into your ear. The night breeze shifts, carrying with it not just spice and song, but also the faint metallic tang of politics. Because beneath Zanzibar's shimmering markets and music-filled courtyards, a new storm was brewing, the storm of empire, in its final European phase. By the late 19th century, Zanzibar was no longer simply a hub of traders and sultans. It had become the glittering jewel that multiple Western powers wanted to claim outright. You wander toward the seafront where the House of Wonders rises above the town. Its coral walls and towering clock face gleam even in the moonlight. Built in 1883 by Sultan Bargash, it was the first building on Zanzibar to have electricity and an elevator, a literal palace of modernity. Locals stared wide-eyed at its lights, whispering that the Sultan had captured stars in his house. But if you squint a little, you can also see the fingerprints of foreign influence all over it. British engineers imported glass iron supports. Even in architecture, Zanzibar was a crossroads caught between tradition and the rising tide of colonialism. European powers circled like sharks. Britain and Germany in particular carved up spheres of influence across East Africa, and Zanzibar stood at the center of their negotiations. Treaties were signed, maps redrawn. In 1890, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty formally declared Zanzibar a British protectorate. To the outside world, it looked neat on paper. To those living here, it meant something more unsettling. The Sultan's authority now sat in the shadow of the Union Jack. Historians still argue whether the sultans were willing participants in this shift, trading partial sovereignty for security, or whether they were simply cornered by pressures too great to resist. Either way, the balance of power tilted. Zanzibar's nutmeg and cloves still scented the world's kitchens, but now the profits were increasingly filtered through British hands. Here's your quirky tidbit: the British obsession with order extended even to the timing of wars. In 1896, when a succession dispute broke out after Sultan Hamad's death, the British Navy issued an ultimatum to the palace. When their deadline expired, they opened fire. The entire conflict, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, lasted only 38 minutes, making it the shortest war in recorded history. Imagine setting your watch to war. You could boil an egg step outside, and by the time you returned, the war would be over. But for Zanzibar, that 38-minute bombardment was no joke. The palace crumbled, dozens were killed, and Britain's dominance was cemented. The House of Wonders survived, ironically still standing, as both marvel and reminder. You sit on its steps now in your mind, staring out over the ocean, and you feel the weight of those minutes stretching like chains into the future. Colonial Zanzibar was not all smoke and rubble, though. It also brought railways, schools and hospitals infrastructure, designed as much for empire's convenience as for local benefit. The population adapted as it always had, folding foreign influence into daily life. Merchants still sold nutmeg and cloves in the markets, women still embroidered colourful kangas with biting Swahili proverbs, children still chased one another through alleys. Empire was just another layer added to the palimpsest of Zanzibar's history, and yet you can sense the subtle shift. Where once Zanzibar had stood as master of its trade, now it was more pawn than player. The British flew their flag over the harbour, and every ship carrying sacks of spice did so under their watchful eyes. The lanterns along the seafront flicker as the tide rises. Stone Town is quieting now, but in the silence you hear the distant rumble of cannon fire, the echo of treaties signed in faraway capitals, the ticking clock of empire. Zanzibar is still fragrant, still alive, but it is also firmly caught in the machinery of colonial rule. The first light of dawn slips across the horizon, and Zanzibar awakens under a sky streaked with gold. The air is cool, laced with the scent of cloves drying on mats, but something deeper stirs beneath the fragrance. The island is inching toward independence, toward a new chapter, where the nutmeg and spice trade is no longer just the prize of empires, but the inheritance of its own people. By the early 20th century, the British protectorate seemed unshakable. Union Jacks fluttered from government buildings, administrators marched in polished boots, and colonial officials drafted reports on spice yields with all the joy of accountants. But the world was changing. 2 world wars shook the globe, and with them came whispers of self-rule. Soldiers from East Africa marched under foreign flags, and when they returned home, they brought back new ideas, dreams of sovereignty, of no longer bending to colonial masters. Zanzibar's plantations kept humming. Clove exports surged during wartime, feeding both military rations and civilian kitchens. Nutmeg, too, found its way into puddings, pies, and comfort foods across Britain. But you can imagine the irony. While Zanzibari spices flavoured the meals of empire, the people who harvested them had little say in their own governance. Historians still argue whether the colonial administration truly developed Zanzibar's economy or simply exploited it. On one hand, roads and ports expanded, literacy rose, and Stone Town gained modern services. On the other hand, profits flowed steadily out of the island, enriching London more than Zanzibar itself. Development was selective, always with one eye on keeping spice exports steady rather than uplifting the whole population. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the 1930s, cloves were so important to Zanzibar's economy that the government actually set up something called the clove monopoly. It controlled prices, exports, and even how many trees could be planted. For farmers, it was like having Big Brother watching over every bud they harvested. Imagine an app today that tracks every slice of pizza you eat and tells you when you've had enough. That's how tightly the spice economy was managed. As the decades ticked forward, nationalism simmered. Political movements grew, often divided along ethnic lines. Arabs, Africans, and South Asians all vying for representation in a system still tilted by colonial legacies. The clove plantations, once symbols of wealth, also became symbols of inequality. Large estates were owned by Arab elites, while African labourers did the backbreaking work. The scent of spice, once intoxicating, now carried a sharper undertone of unrest. By the 1950s and 60s, the winds of independence were blowing hard across Africa. Tanganyika, Zanzibar's neighbour on the mainland, moved toward freedom under Julius Nyerere. The wave was unstoppable. On December 10, 1963, Zanzibar finally achieved independence from Britain, becoming a constitutional monarchy under Sultan Jamshid bin Abdullah. Flags changed, speeches rang out, and for a moment the island stood proud as its own master. But independence was not peace. Beneath the celebrations, tensions bubbled. Just a month later, in January 1964, revolution erupted. Crowds surged through the streets, overthrowing the Sultan in a wave of violence and chaos. The monarchy that had lasted for centuries collapsed overnight, and with it, the old order of spice elites. The aftermath was raw. The revolution led to killings, displacement, and deep scars in Zanzibar's social fabric. But it also gave birth to the People's Republic of Zanzibar, which soon merged with Tanganyika to form modern-day Tanzania. The island that had once been a prize in the hands of empires was now part of a new nation, charting its own course. And through it all, wars, treaties, independence, revolution. The nutmeg trees still swayed in the monsoon winds, their fruit splitting open to reveal seeds wrapped in red lace. Life on the plantations continued, though their ownership shifted. Spices remained central to Zanzibar's economy, but no longer as jewels for foreign crowns. They were now the inheritance of the island itself, however turbulent that inheritance might be. You stand again in a grove dawn mist, clinging to the leaves, and you realize that these trees have witnessed every chapter, from Omani sultans to British colonials, from slave caravans to revolutionaries. Their roots drink history, their branches scatter it on the wind. The morning sun climbs higher, and you breathe deeply. The world has changed. Zanzibar has changed. But the scent of nutmeg is the same as it was 500 years ago when sailors first risked their lives to taste it. The sun now sits high, dazzling over the turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean. You walk the shoreline slowly, the waves lapping at your ankles, carrying with them centuries of echoes. The story of Zanzibar and nutmeg is nearly complete, or perhaps it has only ever been a circle, repeating itself in rhythms of trade power and desire. Nutmeg today is no longer worth a fortune, no longer guarded by fleets of warships or traded for entire cities. You can stroll into any supermarket and pick up a jar of ground nutmeg for a few coins, sprinkle it into your coffee or cookies without a second thought. But here on this island, the memory of what it once meant lingers as strongly as the scent of cloves drying in the sun. Zanzibar's spice farms still thrive. Tour guides lead visitors through rows of cinnamon, turmeric, and nutmeg plucking leaves for you to smell breaking open fruits so you can touch the oily seed red mace glowing like a jewel. School children giggle as they climb trees with the agility of monkeys cutting down coconuts for tourists. Farmers tell stories of how their grandfathers worked these same groves, sometimes under sultans, sometimes under colonial officials, and now under their own hands. Historians still argue whether the spice wars were worth the blood, whether the greed for flavor justifies centuries of conquest and cruelty. Was nutmeg truly the engine of empire or merely a symbol, an excuse for powers that would have fought over something else if not for a seed? You let that debate swirl like spice dust in the air. For you, the truth is simpler. Nutmeg connected the world for better and worse, binding people together through taste, trade, and tragedy. Here's your quirky tidbit to carry home. Nutmeg contains a compound called myristicin, which in very high doses can cause hallucinations. In the 1960s, some hippies even experimented with nutmeg as a cheap psychedelic. Spoiler alert, it mostly just caused nausea and regret. Imagine risking a stomachache from 3 tablespoons of nutmeg in pursuit of enlightenment, definitely not the glamorous high anyone was hoping for. As you wander the modern streets of Stone Town, you notice the contrasts. Wi-Fi signals float above alleys where carved doors still stand. Motorbikes buzz past donkeys laden with sacks of spice. Tourists snap selfies against ruins of old palaces, then head off to the Forodani Gardens for street food spiced with cloves. The past and present live side by side, woven tightly like the strands of a kanga wrapped around a woman's waist. And maybe that's the lesson. Nutmeg was never just about flavor. It was about connection, about how something so small could ripple outward to shape empires, topple rulers, and stir cultures together. Today the world is globalized in ways those sailors could hardly imagine, but it still runs on the same principle. Tiny things matter. A seed, a song, a story. You pause at the harbor one last time. The dhows rock gently in the tide, their sails furled waiting for the wind. You can almost see the ghosts of Portuguese caravels, Dutch galleons, English frigates, French smugglers, Omani warships, all the fleets that once crowded this horizon, hungry for spice. Now the ocean is calm, but its memory is deep. The air is warm, the spices still fragrant, and your eyes grow heavy. The story has carried you far from Banda massacres to stone town alleys, from smuggled seedlings to shortest wars, from slave markets to independence flags. You've walked the circle of Nutmeg's history, and now it settles gently inside you like a spice dissolving into warm milk. And now, as we bring this journey to its quiet close, let the rhythm of the waves slow your breathing. Imagine yourself back in that spice grove, the trees tall and steady, their leaves whispering in the soft breeze. The ground beneath you is cool, the scent of nutmeg and cloves wrapping around you like a blanket. The noise of history fades, the clash of ships, the rumble of treaties, the cries of markets. All of it softens into background hum like distant thunder rolling further and further away. What remains is only stillness, the heartbeat of the island steady and calm. You trace the veins of a nutmeg leaf with your fingertips. Its texture is smooth, its green vivid against the light. Overhead, the branches sway gently, casting dappled shadows across your face. With every movement, a little more sunlight filters through, warming your skin. You let your shoulders relax, the weight of centuries falling away. The sea is near. You hear its hush and pull, a lullaby older than empires. Each wave that rises carries away the echoes of conquest and ambition. Each wave that falls leaves behind nothing but peace. The sand is soft, the air warm, and your eyes drift lower, lower, as though gravity itself is inviting you into rest. Take one last deep breath of spice-scented air. Let it fill your chest, then release it, slowly, like exhaling an entire world. The story of Nutmeg and Zanzibar is complete for now. But your story continues gently in the quiet of the night. Sleep well, traveler. Let the ocean guard your dreams, and may the spices linger only as sweetness on your tongue.